The moment I hung up the phone, I was already pulling my suitcase out from under the bed. It was just past 11 on a Tuesday night, and my cat, Oliver, watched me from the doorway with that look he gets when something is wrong. Animals know. They always know before we do. My daughter-in-law had called, not to tell me something was wrong. She called to ask if I had spoken to my son recently, in that particular tone that meant she was hoping I hadn't. Casual. Too casual. The way someone sounds when they are managing information rather than sharing it. He's been under a lot of stress at work, she said. You know how he gets. I said yes, of course. I said goodnight. And then I sat on the edge of my bed for about 4 minutes and thought about the last time I had actually spoken to my son. 11 days. We had not gone 11 days without speaking since he was 19 years old and working a summer job in Whistler. Even then, he called every Sunday. He called because that was who he was. That was who I raised him to be. I booked a flight to Calgary at 11:47 that night. I took off from Halifax at 6:15 the following morning. I should back up. My name is Maureen. I am 67 years old. I spent 31 years teaching high school English in Dartmouth, Nova Scotia, which is maybe why I have always paid close attention to the things people do not say. My husband, Kenneth, passed away from a sudden cardiac event 8 years ago. He was 59, healthy, or so we thought. He went out for a Saturday morning run and he simply did not come back. After Kenneth died, my son, who was 31 at the time, became the person I leaned on most. Not in a way that was unfair to him, I hope, but he was steady. He was thoughtful. He had his father's way of sitting quietly in a room and making you feel less alone without saying a single word. His name is Ryan. He was a structural engineer with a firm in Calgary. He was good at his work. He cared about it in the way his father cared about things, deeply and without performance. Ryan met his wife, Amber, at a company event 4 years before all of this happened. She worked in marketing. She was attractive, confident, the kind of woman who fills a room without appearing to try. I liked her at first. Most people did. There were things I noticed over time that I kept to myself because that is what mothers do. We bite our tongues and we smile at Christmas dinner, and we remind ourselves that our children are adults who are allowed to make their own choices. Amber cancelled plans frequently and always had a reasonable explanation. She did not come to Ryan's company awards dinner the year he received recognition for his work on a flood mitigation project in Lethbridge. She said she had a prior commitment. She posted photographs of herself at a rooftop bar in Kelowna that same evening. Ryan said she had mixed up the dates. I said nothing. She did not fly back for Kenneth's memorial service 10 years ago. They weren't together then, so I cannot hold that against her. But when my sister Ruth died 2 winters ago, Amber did not come to her funeral in Moncton, even though Ryan drove the 11 hours himself and sat in the front pew beside me with his hand over mine the whole time. Amber said the roads were too dangerous. It was February. The roads were fine. These are not crimes. I know that. But they are a pattern, and I have taught too many years of literature not to recognize a pattern when I see one. The morning I landed in Calgary, Ryan did not know I was coming. I had not told Amber either. I took a taxi from the airport to their house in Cranston, a newer neighborhood in the southeast of the city where the houses all have the same bones, but the people inside them are living entirely different lives. The driveway was empty when I arrived. It was 9:30 in the morning on a Wednesday. Ryan worked from home on Wednesdays. His car was not there. I rang the doorbell. No answer. I have a key. Ryan gave it to me 3 years ago when they went to Portugal for 2 weeks and asked me to check on the house. I used it. The inside of the house was the thing that stopped me cold. It was not dirty exactly. It was abandoned feeling. The kind of stillness that settles into a space when no one has truly lived in it for a while. There was a glass on the kitchen counter with a dried ring of something at the bottom. The blinds in the living room were still drawn. A throw blanket was pushed into the corner of the sofa as though someone had been sleeping there and not bothered to fold it. I walked through the kitchen, down the hall, into the small office where Ryan kept his desk. His laptop was there, a coffee mug, a stack of papers from work with handwritten notes in the margins. Nothing indicated that he had simply stepped out. I called his cell phone from the kitchen. It rang once and went to voicemail. That never happened. Ryan answered his phone. That was simply a fact about him, the way it is a fact about him, the way it is a fact about certain people. I called a second time. Voicemail again. I sat down at the kitchen table and I made myself think clearly, the way Kenneth always told me to do when I was frightened. What do you know for certain, he would say. Start there. What I knew, Ryan had not answered my calls in 11 days. His wife had called me with a question designed to find out how much I knew. His house felt like it had not been properly lived in. His car was not here. I called Amber. It rang 4 times. Maureen, she said, and the way she said my name, not, oh, hi, or is everything okay, just my name, flat and careful, told me she already knew something I didn't. Where is Ryan? I said. A pause. He's in the hospital, she said. He's been there for a little while. He's stable. The floor seemed to shift beneath me slightly, the way floors do when you are standing in a kitchen that belongs to your child and someone is telling you something they should have told you days ago. Which hospital? I said. Foothills. But Maureen, he's stable. There's really no need. Which floor? I said. She told me. I called a taxi. I will not describe the taxi ride except to say that I held my purse in my lap and looked out the window and thought about Ryan at age 7, the way he used to stand at the end of the driveway and wave until my car was completely out of sight before he went back inside. Kenneth said it was because he had a big heart. I thought at the time he might grow out of it. He never did. I checked in at the nursing station on the cardiac unit. I gave Ryan's name. The nurse who looked up his file had the kind of face that has spent years learning how to give information without giving away emotion. And even she paused for a moment before she looked at me. Are you family? She asked. I'm his mother, I said. She led me to the room herself rather than just giving me the number. That told me something. Ryan was asleep when I walked in. He looked smaller than I remembered. That is the terrible thing about hospitals. They make everyone look smaller. The room had the standard cardiac monitor, the IV line, the specific quality of light that only exists in hospital rooms and nowhere else on Earth. There was a chair pulled close to the bed that had a jacket draped over it. Not Ryan's jacket. A woman's jacket. Light grey, the kind from a boutique on 17th Avenue, the kind that costs $400 and is meant to look effortless. It was not Amber's jacket. I knew that because I had seen Amber wearing it in a photograph on her Instagram page, a photograph taken at what appeared to be a wine bar, and the woman wearing the jacket had her arm around a man who was not my son. That thought came later. In the moment, I just stood at the doorway of my son's hospital room and looked at him. He had been there for 13 days. 13 days. The nurse told me, carefully, gently, the way you tell someone something you cannot believe needs to be said, that Ryan had been admitted nearly 2 weeks prior, following a serious cardiac event of his own, that he had a condition, inherited, the kind that can be managed but must be monitored and treated, that his prognosis was cautiously optimistic, provided he received proper care and reduced his stress significantly. She also told me, in the indirect way that medical professionals are trained to communicate, that his listed emergency contact was his wife, that his wife had visited twice in 13 days, and that the last time anyone from his family had been with him was 5 days ago, for approximately 40 minutes. I sat down in the chair beside his bed, not in the chair with the jacket, in the other one, and I took his hand and I waited for him to wake up. He opened his eyes about 20 minutes later. He looked at me for a long moment. Then he said, "Mum." Just that? Just the word. The way a child says it when they have been trying to be brave for a long time and someone they love has finally walked through the door. I told him I was there. I told him I was not going anywhere. I held his hand the way I held it when he was small and frightened, and I did not cry until I stepped into the hallway later to call my sister-in-law Brenda, not the Brenda in the file, my actual sister-in-law. I just want to be clear. And then I cried for a while standing next to a hand sanitizer dispenser outside the elevator, which is not dignified, but grief rarely is. Ryan told me everything over the next 2 days, in pieces, the way sick people tell things, a little at a time, stopping to rest, circling back. His cardiac episode had come on during a work call on a Monday morning. His assistant had called 911. Amber had arrived at the hospital that first evening and had stayed for several hours. But after the initial crisis passed and it became clear that Ryan's recovery would take weeks rather than days, things had shifted. She said she had work commitments. She said her presence wasn't helping him rest. She said she would come when he was feeling better. Ryan had not told me because he was embarrassed. He said that exact word, embarrassed. Embarrassed that his wife was not there. Embarrassed that he was in a hospital bed at 43. Embarrassed that he had not seen the shape of his marriage clearly until he was lying in a place where everything becomes clear. He also told me that he had discovered, the week before his cardiac event, that Amber had transferred a significant sum of money from their joint account into a personal account in her name only. $53,000. This had been their shared emergency fund, built over 7 years, built partly from the money Ryan had inherited from his father. The cardiac event, his doctor told me privately, was almost certainly related to extreme and sustained stress. I am not a soldier. I am a retired English teacher from Dartmouth, but I have spent 67 years on this earth and 31 of those years managing a classroom of teenagers who thought they could outsmart me, and I know how to act when action is required. The first thing I did was call a lawyer. I had a family law referral from a colleague's daughter who had gone through something similar in Ontario. I will not name names, but the referral led me to a very good family law firm in Calgary with an office near the Beltline. I explained the situation. I was told to gather documentation. The second thing I did was speak to Ryan's bank directly, with Ryan present and conscious and providing explicit verbal authorization. We flagged the account transfer for review and began the process of documenting what had moved, when and where it had gone. The third thing I did was call Amber. She answered on the second ring. I could hear in the background the particular ambient noise of a restaurant or bar in the middle of the afternoon. Glasses, music, voices pitched at the volume of people who are relaxed and not thinking about anything serious. I told her I was in Calgary. I told her I had been with Ryan for the past 2 days. I told her I had spoken with his medical team and his lawyer. There was a silence on the line that I can only describe as the sound of a person realizing that the version of the situation they have been managing no longer exists. Maureen, she started. I am not calling to discuss anything, I said. I am calling to inform you. I told her what I knew about the account transfer. I told her that Ryan was aware of it and that documentation had been initiated. I told her that under the circumstances, her sustained absence from her husband's bedside during a serious medical emergency, combined with the financial transfer, her access to the joint account had been suspended pending legal review. She said I couldn't do that. I told her that Ryan could, and had, with my assistance. The noise in the background went quiet, or she moved somewhere quieter. Her voice, when she spoke again, was different, tighter. The practiced casualness was gone. You have no idea what has been happening in our marriage, she said. You're right, I said. But I know what has been happening in that hospital room, and I know what wasn't. What happened after that unfolded over several months, which I will compress because the legal and financial details are, honestly, not the most important part of this story. The account transfer became central to the divorce proceedings. Ryan's legal team documented the timeline. The transfer had occurred 8 days before Ryan's cardiac event, at a time when Amber had already been in contact with a real estate agent about a condo she had been viewing independently. The financial picture that emerged over the course of discovery was complicated, but the core of it was straightforward. She had been planning to leave, and she had been moving assets in preparation. Ryan was in the hospital for 22 days in total. I was there for 19 of them. I slept in the guest room of a colleague of Ryan's who lived in the Altadore neighborhood. His name is Doug, and he is one of those quietly decent people you meet in life who make you feel less cynical about the world. Doug brought soup. He drove me to the hospital and back without being asked. He told me once, in passing, that Ryan had spoken about me often at work, and that his colleagues knew he was someone who had a mother who showed up. I thought about that for a long time afterward. The divorce was finalized 14 months later. The financial settlement was reviewed in light of the documented account transfer, the circumstances of Ryan's hospitalization, and the legal framework under Alberta's Matrimonial Property Act. Amber received significantly less than she had anticipated. Her own legal counsel, from what Ryan was told, had advised her that the documented absence during a medical emergency, combined with the pre-event transfer, substantially weakened her position. I am not going to pretend that there was a clean moment of triumph. Divorce is not like that, even when the outcome is fair. Ryan grieved the marriage. He grieved the version of his life he had been building. He sat with that grief for a long time, and I sat with him through it, not because I could fix it, but because that is what you do. What I will tell you is this. During his recovery, Ryan spent a great deal of time thinking about what he wanted his life to look like going forward. He had always been interested in structural engineering as it related to accessible design, buildings and spaces designed for people with mobility challenges, older adults, people who were too often an afterthought in architectural planning. In the months after his discharge, he began developing a proposal for a community design initiative in partnership with 2 colleagues and a non-profit organization based in Edmonton. The initiative, which received provincial funding approval 2 years after that hospital stay, provides accessible design consultation to low-income housing developments and community spaces across Alberta. Ryan presented at a national engineering conference in Ottawa last spring. I watched the live stream from my kitchen in Dartmouth with a cup of tea and cried for the second time in this story, but this time in the good way. He called me afterward. He sounded like himself again, that steady, warm, unhurried version of himself that I had been so afraid of losing. "How was it?" I asked. "Good," he said. "I kept thinking about what you always told us. About showing up." I told him his father would have been proud. "I know," he said. "I could feel it. I have replayed that phone call many times since then. Not the dramatic parts of this story. Not the hospital room. Not the legal proceedings. Not the moment Amber's voice changed on the phone when she realized what was happening. Those moments are important, and they are part of what happened. But the part that stays with me is my son's voice on the phone from Ottawa, sounding like the person he always was underneath everything that had tried to reduce him. Some people will read a story like this and focus on what Amber did wrong, and she did do wrong. I am not softening that. Abandoning your spouse during a medical crisis while quietly moving $53,000 out of a joint account is not a mistake or a moment of weakness. It is a choice made deliberately, over time, in the direction of self-interest at the cost of someone else's suffering. But what I come back to at 67, after everything, is not her choices. It is the fact that a mother's instinct, the particular, quiet, persistent alarm that goes off when something is wrong with your child, even when no one has told you anything, even when the evidence is only 11 days of silence and a phone call that was too careful, that instinct is real. It is not nothing. It is worth acting on. I was not too old to book a red-eye flight. I was not overreacting. I was not interfering. I was his mother, and he needed someone to walk through that door. So I walked through it. That is the whole story. That is all it ever was. I have been thinking lately about the word instinct and how easily we are trained to distrust it. We are told, especially as mothers of grown children, to step back, to give space, to not assume the worst, to wait for someone to ask for help before offering it. And most of the time, that is reasonable advice. Most of the time, the silence means nothing more than a busy week. But 11 days was not a busy week, And somewhere between hanging up the phone and pulling the suitcase out from under the bed, I made a choice that I believe saved my son's life. Not because I did anything heroic, but simply because I decided to trust what I already knew. That is the first thing I come back to when I think about what happened with Ryan and Amber. Not the legal proceedings, not the account transfer, not the moment her voice changed on the phone. What I come back to is the moment I chose to act on what I felt rather than talk myself out of it. There is a kind of quiet courage in that. Not the dramatic kind, not the kind anyone would put in a headline, but the kind that asks you to trust your own judgment when everything around you is telling you there is probably a perfectly good explanation. Amber made her choices too. I do not spend much time analyzing them anymore. What I do think about is the pattern. The years of small withdrawals, not just from the bank account, but from the marriage itself, the cancelled plans, the absent presence, the slow, deliberate positioning of herself at the exit before anyone else realized the building was burning. The consequences she eventually faced were not punishment. They were simply the natural result of choices made consistently over time in one direction. When you remove yourself from someone's life, piece by piece, eventually the absence becomes official. The law in this case simply caught up to what had already been true for years. What Ryan showed, lying in that hospital bed and then slowly finding his way back to himself, was something I think about more than anything else in this story. He could have hardened. A lot of people would have. Instead, he took everything, the grief, the betrayal, the months of recovery, the long process of rebuilding, and he turned it into something that actually helps people. The accessible, designed initiative he built is not a monument to what he survived. It is evidence of what he chose to do with it. That takes a particular kind of intelligence, the kind that is not about grades or credentials, but about knowing the difference between bitterness and purpose and choosing, deliberately, every single day, the harder of the two. I am 67 years old, and I have buried a husband and a sister, and I have stood in a hospital hallway and cried next to a hand sanitizer dispenser. I have learned that showing up is not a small thing. It is, in many ways, the whole thing. Not showing up in the dramatic sense, booking flights, calling lawyers, freezing accounts, though sometimes that is exactly what is needed, showing up in the daily sense. The phone call on a Sunday. The key you give your mother so she has it, just in case. The colleague who brings soup and drives you back and forth without being asked. Kenneth used to say that the measure of a person is not what they do when everything is easy. Anyone can be decent when nothing costs them anything. The measure is what they do when it is inconvenient, when it requires something, when walking away would be so much simpler. Ryan built something real out of the worst year of his life. That is the story I tell myself when I wake up at 3 in the morning and replay the parts I cannot change. That is the story that matters.